Lock your doors, close your windows, turn off the lights. It's time for your ghoulish literary nightmare. This is Illiterate, starring Evan
And Taylor, who read a book this week.
and I watched a movie. Welcome, everyone. It's nice to have you back. Whew. I'm out of my willies scared right now, Taylor.
Evan said he was going to speak in that voice the whole time.
Welcome, everyone. This is Illiterate. This week, we are covering Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Who's it by, Taylor? I don't have the note.
It is by Alvin Schwartz.
This one is a childhood favorite. I know all you guys out there know this. For those that don't, this is the time. Get into it. It's really cool. These are books that I grew up my childhood with. I had a little bit of an older brother who kind of introduced them to me. And he is also a special effects makeup artist working in Hollywood now. So you can see that the horror elements boiled up early there and kind of...
In the Russell household.
Yes.
And I didn't know too much about this. It's 3 books, actually. It's a trilogy. So it was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, which came out in 1981, and then More Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark in 1984, and then Scary Stories 3, More Tales to Chill Your Bones in 1991.
Yes.
So a full thing, 82 stories in total. It's a sequence of shorter stories. Most of them are just a page or two, not very long.
So much fun.
So much fun. Aimed at younger readers, which is where the controversy comes in about this whole series.
If you're just coming to this, go and Google this because the artwork is such a point of contention here. The artwork that this was released with has become so famous and so revered that it kind of is the linchpin for why it's so popular and why it also is one of the most banned books all over the place. Just because the imagery is... It really teeters a line.
Yeah.
I mean, it's gorgeous stuff, but it teeters a line when you're thinking about it educationally and for children. I can see why there are concerns about it, but ultimately, I think when down to it, they're black and white. But, it's an interesting conversation.
So Stephen Gammell was the artist, and he's illustrated over 60 books now in the children's scene, and most of them are not like this, but he uses a watercolor style. Like you said, it's black and white.
Well, Toad and Frog.
Yeah. Little Bo Peep. Oh my God. But so I'll post a link of a YouTube video showing his process. There's another book. It's not for this book, but you can see how detailed and how cool. It looks so crazy to try and make these watercolors and how detailed it is, but they do lend themselves to very creepy kind of artworks, and so he got involved in this, and this is probably his biggest claim to fame. But the artwork definitely creates a terror, and that's why a lot of people are like, no, kids should not only should they not be reading these stories that have no potential moral and are spooky and creepy, but look at these pictures. Yeah. They're very grotesque and just straight
You're gonna horrify some children. Yeah. And to be fair, it does stick with you. Like I did experience these as a young child, and you just showed me a drawing I hadn't seen since being a young child, and I remembered it vividly. I'm like, yep, that's
yeah.
We should also mention on the top, obviously, the movie just came out last Friday,
right?
Which I went and saw last night. So as we go along, I'll be kind of chiming in and comparing and talking about points with that. I guess that was a good little brief overview, but let's get into it.
So like I said, there's 82 stories. I'll post a link to an article where they rank all 82 stories, just whatever journalist wanted to say which ones were the best. But if you were like, wow, I'm never going to read these. But if you just want to get a summary of kind of which ones, scroll all the way down to the top 10, and you can see which are the ones that most people are talking about. And they are probably also the ones which are in the movie. Because the movie, if you can frame it a little bit for us, takes one of the stories and turns it into a larger narrative.
Yes.
And then they intersperse the spooky moments as certain of the classic top short stories.
They take one of I think it's the last story in the first book called The Haunted House or something to that effect, and they change it a little bit. That becomes the umbrella for the whole film. It's that a woman was wrongfully killed by her family and it was covered up, and so now she's taking it out through these stories. It was like she was locked up by herself for her whole life, and all she had was writing and stories and all that kind of stuff. So now these kids break into this house to, screw around, just doing kid stuff, pretty innocent, and they happen upon her little room downstairs and find the book, wake up the spirit, and this basically what amounts to a shadow is like looming over them and following them and the town for the rest of the movie. But she opens up the book, and the book starts writing new stories involving people she now knows, like names like Tommy and Augustus and all that. And it's happening live. So they're watching it being written right in front of them. And so those stories will be smaller variations on the exact same stories in the book. And you can see when they flip through, there's plenty of them that are taken directly out of the book.
Yeah. I guess the big thing that then comes about that the movie might do or might not do is create the controversy that the books brought about, which is this for kids? Is it not for kids?
Right.
What's going on with this?
This doesn't really like lean up against that the rating too hard. Like it's squarely PG-13, but I do want to say I was pretty impressed just tonally by it. It didn't feel PG-13. There didn't feel like a lot of moments where they were holding it back. Everything they were showing you felt contextually correct for what was happening.
And maybe it's also just the matter of we've moved as a society into being a little bit less stifled in the media that we present to our kids. And so when this came out in the 80s as a book,
right,
and is in school libraries, and kids are picking it up and being terrified.
And you get one image and your mind gets to run wild with it, whereas a movie, it's much more pinned down, and the filmmakers are showing you image by image what is the reality. So it's a bit, you don't get to run totally wild with your imagination. Right. Though I think leaning on the PG-13 side, when it comes to the gruesomeness, they leave that room for the imagination to help make this scarier than it really is, which is like really leaning into the strengths of the book.
And so, yeah, exactly. That's what the book does really, really well, is this Alvin Schwartz guy. He started out as a journalist. He was writing for the Binghamton Press from 51 to 55, and then moved and started working for a research corporation, hated it. Got into children's writing, and he'd written other books that were more goofy and silly and, books like How to Be a Father, How to Fly a Kite, Catch a Fish, Grow a Flower, Other Activities to Do with Your Child.
Being human.
Little silly.
Being a human child.
Little silly wisecrack joke books, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Not a bad guy, has several children. And so when you look at him as like, oh, is he trying to be a weird Stephen King for kids? Not really. He imbues it with the same energy that he brought to his other books for kids, but took the horror angle.
He just went hard on genre.
Yeah, exactly. And so
you got to teach them genre somehow. Yeah. And this is how you institute the just what is inherent about genre. I mean,
and like you said with the movie, in relation to the book and the ambiguity, the stories are only a page or two in length, and he keeps them relatively vague. It's very simple language. I looked up, and in the Lexile scale, which is what you use for how, I don't know, what grade you have to be to read.
Beyonce's lyrics are 5th grade level, I think.
And this is also Beyonce's lyrics. This is right at a 5th grade level.
There we go. It's Beyonce level, y'all.
Yeah, it's not Bernie Sanders level. He's like 11th grade in his speeches. Yeah. But anyway, so it's the same thing where you're reading it and it's like a man is walking down the lane. It could be Victorian England. It could be your suburb, but you fill in all of the gaps for what that is. So the controversy that then comes with the artwork too, with the ambiguity, it is very vague, these amorphous kind of watercolor black and white shapes, and then they're also 99% of the figures just face directly the reader, which I didn't realize. So the faces are right up in your face. They're staring at you on the page, and that's the way that he's drawn them. There was a big controversy with the artwork because they re-released the books as a treasury in 2011.
No, boo! Boo! Yeah, I was on that train. And like, how dare you? How dare you? It's the whole, it's like, it is, these books would have just been forgotten and nobody would have even read them had it not been paired with this amazing artwork. I'm not saying that that it doesn't have literary value. It obviously does, but it is the artwork that has propelled this and kept this in the spotlight the entire time. And so to re-release it and change it, do you even know what you're doing?
You feel bad for the guy who redrew, because the drawings that he's drawn are just as beautiful. But like you said,
absolutely. I mean, that's fair. That is fair. I mean, it's just very. If silly. Those had been the original drawings, no one would be talking about this. Yeah. They're just not challenging. Not because that they're not good.
Yeah. There had been other compilations of scary stories for kids before.
Right.
Notably, probably not as graphic, but like you said, in marriage with the artwork, creates an entirely different experience for kids. But I'll post a link to an article that I read where they side by side compare the different pieces of artwork from various stories. And you can see, like I said, how this guy draws the two people walking down the lane, and it's clearly Victorian men in top hats, and they're off in the distance.
Right.
And you're no longer scared because you're removed from it. You're like, I don't know, I'm a 7-year-old. I don't care.
London 1700.
Yeah, exactly. But again, going back to the controversy, the thing that came about was it was the number one most challenged, meaning not, like we said, 5th grade Beyonce level, but challenged, meaning people wanted it banned from schools. There was arguments to have it removed. For all of the 90s, from 90 to 99, it was on the number one spot of challenged
We
books.
had him. Oh, we had him. Oh, yeah, we had him.
Yeah.
I was talking to my mom about this last week. She has no recollection of buying them.
Wow.
I actually have no idea how they came into our possession.
Just as spooky.
I went as far to show her the artwork, show her the covers. I was texting this whole conversation. I'm like, Mom, how have you never seen these books? You know what your sons do for a living now. Like,
yeah.
Wait, but you didn't buy them? We know Dad didn't buy them. Who bought these books, Mom?
The lady on page 16, that's who bought them. With the hole in her face.
We kind of chuckled about it, and she's like, well, he probably just brought them home from school or something.
Stole them from the library.
Yeah.
And then there was no controversy. Nobody had to write in. They're like, oh, they must have removed the books. No, Evan stole them and brought them home.
I'm perpetuating the allure of look, they're gone from the library.
See, the man got us. But the thing that happened with the books being taken away is that the Schwartz guy, Alvin Schwartz, the guy who wrote it, he died in 1992. So like I said, the last book came out in 91. So he got to see a little bit of the backlash, but all of it being on the number one most challenged was in the 90s.
Right.
So he didn't even really get to see the repercussions of his books being challenged to the degree that they have, which is also kind of interesting to me that he knew that was coming about. But really, you can also point the finger easier at a guy who's dead who can't defend himself and defend his work against saying like, hey, no, this is good for kids. This is having them, it gets them interested in reading. It gets them to learn more about themselves.
Yeah, the book has no defense.
It's not actually.
There's no defender who's standing up and being like, well, this is what the book actually is because he knows it better than the
American Library Association. The only people that stood up for it. But yeah, the
Thank you, American Library Association. Thank you.
Yeah, for keeping it together.
Thank you.
The main problems that people had with it was that there's, they say there's no morals to the stories. The bad guys always win. It makes light of death. These kind of classic horror responses. But I think what he was going at, and I read some interviews with him, the idea behind it was not to scare kids. He purposefully there's lots of death in them, but there's not explicitly kids dying.
Death.
And it's more like with
different in the movie.
Well, the movie's a little different. But in the movie, like you said, it's ambiguous. There's not so much gore and gruesomeness. In the books themselves, the first maybe 4 or 5 stories are called jump stories. And so it's designed for you to read them, and it's got a little like parentheses at the end, and it's like you jump at the people listening and you say, and it was you, and then you scare your neighbors or whatever. They're designed to be silly and spooky for kids.
Because the enemy is us.
And it's you. Exactly. And so he's teaching kids to say like, enjoy storytelling, enjoy creating a little bit of fear. Or it's like, I was walking home and there was this guy with really long teeth and he made me really scared. And then I ran and then I saw a second guy and there were teeth even longer than him. And then the third guy has the longest teeth even longer than the first. And I ran all the way home and locked the door. And that's all the story is. There's no thing except maybe a minor.
See the shadow of a 6-foot tall bunny rabbit in the corner, like you can't see it. But it's just the shadow, the silhouette of a massive bunny. That's how I wish that story ended.
Well, that's how some of them end. You know what I mean? It's like
exactly.
It's not,
absolutely.
It's more what can your mind conjure?
Absolutely, which I've always been more interested in. Perhaps this is it, but. Because I've always been a horror guy, obviously, I say this over and over again. But so when the horror movie remake craze started in the early 2000s, I was all about it because I was basically too young then. So I remember one of the very first ones that really set it off was the remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. It came out in 2003. And what I liked about that film is that it hides all of the gore. It really leaves it up to your imagination. It's not a gore fest. And that is a way that you can go with these stories. Now, that's still an R-rated film, but they're choosing what to show you, what not to show you, when to engage your imagination and when not to. And as a child even, I'm taking notes off of that, of how that actively has my mind working more than if I was just shown the imagery. And I think it relates right back to scary stories. You have to do the work. Yeah. You have to be engaged. And it gets you engaged. That's a testament to how it's written, is it gets you engaged. But once you are engaged, you paint so much of the color. Because it doesn't have any. Like, it is so dependent on what you bring to it.
It helps kids, and these for the people arguing for these books, it helps kids delineate what is actually truly scary and shocking and horrifying and what is going on as a 7-year-old in real life to you. It's like, oh, there's this butcher and he's grinding people up, and then somebody finds out because the fat kid goes missing, and then the butcher, they don't know what happened, but he's never seen again. But they had really good sausage that night. Leave it up to the imagination. That's horrifying for a kid. But at the same time, you're saying
but you're engaging that, look, they have to put together the pieces. But if you just take what you just said, you have to do the secondary work there. You have to put together the pieces. You actually have to do it instead of it just being told to you plainly. I wish people would. I know the artwork gets so much attention, but it really is both together that created such a potion, I think. It grabs you and it makes you paint it. It makes you fill in the blanks.
I read this because there's been tons of academic journals and things like that on this and how it affects kids, and people are interested in the educational scene, comparing things and asking kids and doing surveys and saying, what is this actually doing?
Right.
You got to get boots on the ground and figure it out. But I liked this article that I read where this person was interviewing kids and saying kind of what their experience of it was. In their limited vocabulary and what they know about the world, there's still insight into. You just ask the kid, what do you think about it? Why do you like it? Why don't you like it? That kind of thing. So
Absolutely.
There's a famous story from there called The Green Ribbon or something like that. And it's one of at the end of a lot of the books too, he's like, these are explicitly spooky, but they're supposed to be more funny than spooky. Like there's a silly end to it in a way. So there's this woman who has this green band ribbon around her neck, and that's the whole thing. And people think it's beautiful. And this guy marries her and they go through the whole marriage or whatever, and he never asks because it's so beautiful. And then he's like, oh, well, I think either she dies or, I think she dies. And then it's like, oh, well, we want to, so they take the ribbon off and then her head falls off. Like it was holding her head onto her body. And so this is a direct quote I'm going to read now from a kid when they asked, like, hey, what did you think about that story? Because, of course, the kids scream out every time you read it, and you get to the end, and it's like, well, then her head fell off, and kids are like, her head fell off. So this kid said, Chris, I think, some 7-year-old, he's like, I like this book because it is scary, and it is about a girl that took a ribbon off of her neck, and the head fell off of her neck. This is a good book for children. My favorite part is when her head fell off. This is my favorite part because it is exciting. I felt scared when I read this book. I recommend this book to people who like scary books and funny books.
It's scary and funny.
Yeah.
He sounds untraumatized.
Well, and it's because it's exciting. It's shocking.
Absolutely.
And there are things that our kids are having to reckon with life. Your parents get divorced. That's shocking.
Yeah.
It's also really scary. But it's not the same as somebody's head falling off.
Right.
And when is that actually going to happen to a kid ever? But I do want to talk also about how, because we mentioned the artwork and how it ties into the stories themselves. There are also, what I didn't realize about this book, he devotes probably a 10th of each of the books in the back entirely to the history of the stories, the research that he did going into them, because all of these are based on old folklore.
Oh my gosh,
and old tales.
Yeah. Seriously.
And so it's all like bibliography in the back and how he transmuted them into other things or what the lineage is of these kinds of stories.
That's incredible. That's what I want to hear about.
Yeah, so we'll just go into some of the stories, which like there's the famous one is the first one in the first book called The Big Toe. Yeah. And I know that is
in the movie. Yep,
into the movie. So that's a famous story that has a lineage of stealing something from the dead that doesn't belong and it has to be returned to atone. And so the original story is it doesn't really make any sense. It's really weird. This kid is just shoveling in the dirt as little kids do. They just milling around in the dirt. And he pulls out this big toe in the dirt.
Mm-hmm,
Clearly, you know, oh, there's a corpse underneath it, whatever. So he takes it, and his mom is, and he's like, what do we do with this? And his mom's like, let's cook it and put it in a stew. And so then they do, and then he goes to bed, and he hears, oh, the big toe, this voice, where is it? Where's my big toe? And then it's this creepy toeless woman that runs up, and she's like, you have it. And then the story just ends. But it came from an old Brothers Grimm story that's very similar, from the 1800s. And just so people know, those are the dudes that wrote Cinderella, Hansel and Gretel, Rapunzel, Snow White, which are also, you can realize, are kind of like fairy tale fables.
A future episode, I'm sure.
Yeah, but they're also a little bit horrifying if you go back and look at the original ones. They're not the cutesy Disney version, so they do have an element of terror as well for kids and adults. But then that story, like I said, of taking something that doesn't belong to you gets updated throughout history.
Right.
And so Mark Twain actually had a version of this story called The Golden Arm, which is a bit more of a moral about greed. So it's this guy who has this arm made of gold, and then when he dies, somebody digs him up to take it to make money, and then that guy comes back from the dead and tries to grab him. But Mark Twain would use this when he'd go on tour for his speaking and whatnot, and would use it to teach people how to tell a story, very similar to what Alvin Schwartz does in this book, where he's like, and then you jump at your audience. And I'll post a link to an article of Mark Twain's specific words. If he's like, this is how you say it. You look for somebody in the audience to do this. This is how the story goes. And then at this point, he's like, it always gets a yelp, and it always gets people interested in the rest of what I'm going to say.
From beyond the grave, coaching you.
Yeah, and you said that in the movie that it is a lot about these other stories and the main characters having interest
So I can take you through this story and how they've changed this to fit this in. So a pot of stew appears in one of the main characters' fridges, and he's on the phone with his parents, and who, through conversation, you immediately know are away for the night, and it was unexpected. You know, they're just like talking about the routine tonight. Yeah. And he sees, well, I'm just going to eat the stew in here, and then you just hear like, I don't know, somebody made it, you know, and and as the audience, I'm like, not even like, I haven't clicked that this is the big toe one yet. I'm not really thinking any of that yet. He gets called by the other main characters on the walkie-talkie, and they're watching the story being written right now, and they're screaming at him, don't eat anything, but he can't hear because there's a thunderstorm or something outside. But it's a slow realization while he's talking to them on the walkie-talkie for him realizing that what they're saying is playing out in real life out in front of him. And so they're reading as it's being written, like, and you're going to hear this voice, and then it all gets... you know, so they do a really good job of adjusting the story to make it fit, but then keeping all of really what is inherent about the story intact. And they did a great job of recreating the ghoul in this fashion too. They go out of their way to try and recreate these original pieces of artwork as real characters. It's pretty fascinating to see, actually.
Yeah, I was just fascinated how, when I flipped through and then I got to the end and I was like, oh, there's a whole other portion of this book that's like, oh, now I can look back and see, okay, well, the story where he was talking about the scarecrow comes from this and this and this, and comes from this Eastern Appalachian, West Virginian, story and that kind of thing.
That's incredible. But real quick, because I forgot to, it's not outright depicting child death and murder. They're inventive with the way that they actually resolve these things. So the corpse with missing the big toe is like lumbering through his house, and he eventually sequesters himself into his room, not knowing what to do. There's no lock on his door. It's 1968. They do a good job of just trying to neutralize your setting to kind of just put it in anywhere. It's a period piece, but then they kind of let it fade away a little bit. Like all the period is there, but it's really well done. You're really just focused on the characters, and it does a good job of it's not London 1700. You know,
you're like, cool, I can't relate to
this.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, so kid's trapped in his bedroom, and he hides under the bed. The door opens, but nothing comes in. He slides halfway out from underneath the foot of the bed. Looks up to see if it's like on top of the bed, and then realizes no, it is just under the bed with him, and it drags him what would be to the wall, like at the head of his bed, and it just extends into blackness and nothing. And so his friends that were just on the walkie-talkie with him are on the way there because they know what's happening. They're trying to get there fast enough, and they get into the room, and they move the bed, and they just see scratch marks to the wall.
Right.
And so in each instance, there's this kind of like mystifying vanishing.
People just go.
Exactly.
Well, that's good. There's also stories in this we probably have heard of them, and I'll post a link to the trailer also if you know nothing about the movie, and you can see some of these instances in the trailer. But the classic one is like a spider boil thing, and I've heard this a million times where it's like, you just hear this story, somebody goes to the Amazon jungle or something and gets bitten, and then it's this thing that grows on their arm or their face or whatever, and then a bunch of spiders, you know, it's a spider that's, and then they all explode and crawl everywhere. It's gross. But that one is also, again, in the back of the book saying, well, this comes from these urban myths or folk tales, that kind of thing. There's the other one that's in the book, maybe it's not in the movie, but the flashing headlights, where it's usually a young girl who's driving and there's somebody.
I love this one.
There's somebody who's usually a suspicious person, like a lumberjack or a big oafish guy or somebody that looks really scary, and they're flashing their headlights at her. And so she speeds up and they speed up, and she passes and they pass.
Yeah.
And they keep flashing their headlights, and then she stops and to see the person come out with an axe or a shotgun or some similar thing, and she runs into the house and is like, help, help, help. And the person runs after her and is like, no, there's somebody in your back seat. And that's why I was flashing lights every time they come up. And maybe as she's passing, the story gets larger and larger, and she sees that, you know, on the news or on the radio, a prison inmate has escaped, that kind of thing. This all comes from these old urban myths.
That exact story did get done in Urban Legend. It was an old 90s horror film. A bunch of popular 90s actors at the time. But I remember that sequence vividly. And another, I would say, actually, now that I think about it, Urban Legend kind of pairs, it might be a little bit more of the adult version of the scary stories to tell in the dark, because they are taking what are these actual old myths and playing them out in a contextual, updated way for the time. That was 1998. But yeah, I hadn't thought about that comparison before, but they do that story exactly like that.
And I think the big thing between the movie and the book, as we're talking about these various urban legends and myths, and mixing in with the old folk tales that then get updated, or he keeps them ambiguous, but they're based on old grim tales, is, and a thing I saw a quote in a review for the movie is like, it's training wheels horror done right. You give kids just enough. And this is the same thing you might have said with the movie, where it's just enough that you would feel okay. Maybe the kid would be a little creeped out, but if they're into that, taking a middle schooler to go see this, same thing with the book, and that's why kids loved it. It's like just on their level without being so over the top gratuitous, but not so underwhelming.
This walked I have to say, it was a really great line where it didn't feel like it was holding back anything. It was just contextually correct. It never felt watered down. It never felt like they were playing to a younger audience. It just felt what was necessary for this story. And as a filmmaker, I really like that, where I'm not seeing the decisions to get the rating on the board, because I know they wanted a PG-13 rating, but it's not cut like a PG-13 movie at all. In fact, it's cut for the story. I have to hand it to them on that manner, because it feels really nice. And I wasn't expecting that. I was expecting something a bit cheaper, a bit more just by the numbers.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, and here's something interesting, because something that has come out as a movie that some people might have thought is a bit cheaper and a bit more by the numbers is Goosebumps, which maybe a lot more people know that as like the kids horror story stuff. So I looked up the history of this, and like I said, the last Scary Stories 3 came out in 91. Alvin Schwartz died in 92. The first Goosebumps book came out in 92.
Oh, man.
So this was after. This is the predecessor to Goosebumps.
Oh, I didn't even realize that. I thought Goosebumps was parallel.
No, Goosebumps is after. So it's definitely, Goosebumps is a lot more tame and a lot more silly and still a little spooky. But
I was into those too,
R.L. Stine is quoted as saying he didn't even necessarily care as much about the story. He just wanted to get kids to read. And so he thought he was successful in doing that. Because that's the criticism of Goosebumps, is like, oh, it's cheap. You know, it's simple. Like, it has no artistic merit, where I think as Alvin Schwartz didn't care as much about getting kids to read, but wanted and came from the old back catalog of stories.
Yeah,
and that's what he wanted
think
kids
classically
to care
about story,
Yeah. So that made me interested as I was looking into Goosebumps, was the history of children's horror.
Yeah.
Because I just knew about this, and then you go into Goosebumps, but I'm like, where does this lead
else is it?
back? Yeah. And just horror in general. So going way, way back to the beginning.
Here we go.
Little history lesson from dear old Taylor. Works of fiction that were scary were all religious.
Yeah.
Way back. There was nothing, at least I'm speaking, so just so everybody knows, I'm speaking in the terms of the Western world. I didn't go into all literature of all the world.
Copy
Byzantine.
That. Yep.
So sorry about that, but it's just what I could find as far as that track.
Join us next week for our 6-part series on horror in the West.
In world literature. But as far as the Western world, mostly religious. So like Dante's Inferno, Paradise Lost, there was some religious element to it.
Yeah.
Being in the seven levels of hell, that kind of thing. And that was in the 1600s. And then we move into plays. So we talked about this in our Hamlet episode, the Spanish tragedy, which Kyd had made before Hamlet. And then Hamlet, that had to do with ghosts. But again, religious. Are they going to hell or purgatory or what have you? Then we go into kind of the Gothic stories. And this comes about in the time of cultural anxiety. Usually these kind of stories come about. They give evil their own space. So this is between 1764 to 1840. Most literary critics have it as. And you get stories like Frankenstein, which comes out in 1818.
Here we go.
The Vampire in 1819. Edgar Allan Poe's stuff comes out in the 1830s. This is also when the Brothers Grimm comes out in the 1830s. Hans Christian Andersen in 1835. Ooh. There's also more female writers in this space, which is interesting.
Yeah. Isn't it?
And so I looked up, and this is probably the most synonymous or similar to the scary stories to tell in the dark. There's a guy named Heinrich Hoffmann, who's a German guy, clearly. And he wrote a book called Struwwelpeter, which came out in 1854. It directly translates to Shaggy Peter, which is the name of the character, the titular character. And it's 10 stories, basically, of the disastrous consequences of misbehavior of children, designed to be over the top and crazy. I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But the cover, and again, it's got crazy artwork designed to scare the kids. So Struwwelpeter, basically, he like doesn't want to bathe, doesn't want to clean himself, doesn't want to be maintained as a kid. And his hair grows out super frizzy, and his fingernails are really long, and he just looks insane. But it's designed to be over the top to scare kids. Similarly, there's like a kid who sucks his thumb and won't stop doing that, and so there's a tailor who cuts his thumb off, or this kid is making fun of these kids are making fun of a darker skinned boy, so they get dunked in ink and are completely dark. Or this girl who's playing with matches and then ignites herself on fire. Just like over the top, and kids realize that even in 1850, you know, like that's not going to happen to them actually, but it was scary and spooky and a bit silly, and also comes with over the top artwork designed to scare them.
That sounds so similar to scary stories.
It's like, an anthology of short stories for kids. Yeah. And then, of course, another parallel that I found that was interesting, Mark Twain wrote a U.S. version of it when he was around in the 1900s. It all comes full circle. So then after that, there's these books called Penny Dreadfuls, which you might have heard that terminology before. And they were small books that had little scary stories. This is where Sweeney Todd came about. And then there was another famous character called Varney the Vampire. And these were not intentionally necessarily aimed at kids, but they were huge with youths of the time in the mid-1800s and the Industrial Revolution and everything, because they were getting passed around. It was also, they were a penny, but even still you couldn't afford them, so it would get passed from kid to kid. Going around.
Interesting. Wow.
So now we're moving into the late 1800s. We've got Dracula in 1897. And also around this time, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But the interesting thing about this, now we're seeing where the evil is more internalized, right? As opposed to being this gothic force.
It's more deceiving. It's more paranoid now.
And within. So the big change that happens here is in 1910, there was a movie version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And this is really bringing horror to the forefront to the less literate people. And also, instead of it being in your imagination, there is the physical movie behind it. So then we're going into the U.S., since that's where we are. And we've got this series called Weird Tales, which came about in 1923. And that tided people over in the Great Depression. As well as these horror-themed radio shows. You know, like Lights Out, like your impression. So that kind of stuff kept people tided over in times of great financial duress. We've got World War II that comes in, and horror was not popular in this time because it was real.
Right.
You know what I mean? It was on the freaking world stage.
And the world is horrific.
And so like you don't need that escape in that moment or a parallel to be like,
how bad can things get?
Well, we're kind of in it right
now. Handling a lot right now.
But it resurged because in 1954, I Am Legend came out by Richard Matheson. And
I always forget how early that is. My gosh.
And then also we had Ed Gein, who inspired Psycho in 59.
Oh, yeah. Don't get me started on Ed Gein.
We're inspired into the real world. And then we have the
Texas Chainsaw later.
We see more inspirations, like I said, like we're seeing, the world is, we don't need these vampires and things like that. But then the Cold War comes about, and we have more external threats. So we have Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and Stephen King coming about in the 70s. Where the evil is still sitting in time with actual human beings. Right. So that, I know that didn't necessarily all meld into children's stories, but then, like I said, in the 80s, we have this.
Yeah.
Which is a scary stories, and then Goosebumps.
Definitely. And then right there, parallel with Goosebumps, I'm thinking so it was a Nickelodeon show, Are You Afraid of the Dark?
For kids.
Right after that. That's an interesting one, too, which I think they're also making into a movie right now.
So certainly everything's being made into a movie.
Another future episode.
Yeah, but that's kind of the history then. If one was interested in where we get to getting kids to read this, because a lot of that stuff is not for kids, but we even see, like, even with the Struwwelpeter as old as the 1850s,
yes,
kids do need a balance.
A little bit of a shock to know what is possible before they come up on that line. Children don't know. We have to teach them, and it can't every time be by mistake, because sometimes mistakes you can't fix, so it's just, there's a balance there, but it's an interesting thing that, like, at some point you do need to, at some level, kind of shock a child to show them what is possible so that it doesn't get to that point, whatever the moral may be. And, like, it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, I'm not a horror fan, and like there are some people, like, you obviously gravitate towards it more than I do. You should still be exposed, like, get a taste of it. You don't have to love scary stories to tell in the dark as a kid, but you should be told spooky stories at a slumber party, when you're in middle school,
or next time you go camping. Somebody,
if nothing for the historical element of saying, like, hey, these are stories that got passed down.
Definitely.
And you get a broader knowledge of literature and history, and saying, like, we all have dealt with these fears. Hey, this story about the big toe, that came from the 1800s.
That's so cool.
People are still worried about what happens after you die.
See, I want this copy that you have. Is this the omnibus? It has all three of them in it?
All three of them.
Taylor has the hardback here with it has it all in one thing. I really now want this thing because I really just kind of, I almost want to keep it in my car just for any time of, like, going, or like a travel book. Like, I feel like
well,
it feels like a communal thing. Like, it feels like I want this and I want a deck of cards, like, in the bag
anytime
to go,
You're doing a bonfire on the beach or something.
Anywhere, anytime there's, you have downtime and there's not an immediate distraction and you have to think of something else to do. And
also, if you're musically inclined, I didn't mention this, but there's little songs that he's come up with that are based on old songs as well, kind of spooky songs. And it's got the through line and melody notation, like the first bar, so you could play if you know how to read music.
I was listening. There's an audiobook version that actually has somebody, an
singing,
old man, creepily do the hearse song, which I remembered vividly from my childhood. It's not strictly short stories. It's
how to tell a story and have a jump scare, little poems, little songs. It's a whole
what was behind this story. Here, instead of a story, this is just a song that's really gruesome about why you should not laugh at hearses going by. And that was I have to say, it taught me that lesson as a child. Like, that's where I became like, oh, so a hearse means this, and I one day might do that, and a teaching a respect there and understanding. Like, I remember being 5 years old and it clicking what the song was really saying to me, and I've never forgotten. And that's how I learned. When I see a hearse going by down the road, like a funeral
procession,
exactly, a funeral procession going by, it's like I think of this book almost every time now, and I think about how I better not smirk. That's the truth.
I didn't read it, so I smirk all the time. Then I'm going to be in a hearse, I was going to say, if you did, dear listener, want this book as Evan wants it so badly, we do have, as a shameless promo, we do have a link in the show notes where you can buy the book from a local independent bookstore.
Yeah, you help your local independent bookstores. It helps out the show as well. It's called Indie Bound. Look for it in the show notes.
But that'll
it's super
be in
cool.
there.
I love the thing. I like, because I don't want to buy from Amazon. I don't want to buy from Walmart. I don't want to buy from Target. Like, I'm growing really fond of local businesses, mom and pop places, and this is a community that connects all independent bookstores across the country, and it's just invaluable.
It's wonderful. Do you have another announcement for us?
Check out our hilarious Instagram. That is the place for the hot memes, the lulz. Get in contact with us. That's where you're gonna find out when the next show is, all that kind of stuff.
Slide into the DMs.
Yeah. It's at illiterate_pod on Instagram. Perfect. Really love if you follow us.
It was a blast. I was spooked.
This was a spooky one. I loved it.
Go out there, stay spooky, y'all.
Thanks, guys.